Shortly after the end of World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, the Red Scare took hold in the United States. A nationwide fear of communists, socialists, anarchists, and other dissidents suddenly grabbed the American psyche in 1919 following a series of anarchist bombings. The nation was gripped in fear. Innocent people were jailed for expressing their views, civil liberties were ignored, and many Americans feared that a Bolshevik-style revolution was at hand. Then in the early 1920s, the fear seemed to dissipate just as quickly as it had begun, and the Red Scare. At the time World War I armistice was executed in 1918, approximately 9 million people worked in war industries, while another 4 million were serving in the armed forces. Once the war was over, these people were left without jobs, and war industries were left without contracts. Economic difficulties and worker unrest increased. As economic difficulties and worker unrest increased, strikes began to take place throughout the United States. One common characteristic that many of these strikes had was that they were all violent in nature. The same type of radical behavior was occurring in Eastern Europe, and thus many Americans believed that communism or a non-democratic government was a threat to our democratic way of life in the United States. Two main union or socialist groups stood out at the time. The International Workers of the World, the IWW or Wobblies as they were nicknamed, centered in the northwest portion of the country and were led by Big Bill Haywood, and the Socialist Party was led by Eugene V. Debs. Both these groups were well-known objectors to World War I, and to the minds of many Americans, therefore, were unpatriotic. This led them open to attack. Any activity even loosely associated with them was suspicious. One of the first major strikes after the end of World War I was the Seattle shipyard strike of 1919. On January 21st, 35,000 shipyard workers in Seattle struck. A general strike resulted when 60,000 workers in Seattle area struck on February 6th. Despite the absence of any violence or arrest, the strikers were immediately labeled as Reds who in charges that they were trying to incite revolution were leveled against them. Hysteria struck the city as department stores, grocery stores, and pharmacies were flooded by frightened customers trying to ensure that they would be able to survive a prolonged strike. The Seattle strike suddenly became national news, with newspaper headlines across the United States telling of Seattle's impending doom and potential loss to the Reds and urging for the strike to be put down. Seattle Mayor Ole Hansen, who had long hated the Wobblies and took the strike as a personal affront to him, took the offensive against the strikers. He guaranteed the city's safety by announcing that 1,500 of the city's policemen and an equal number of federal troops were at his disposal to help break the strike and keep the peace. On February 10th, realizing the strike could not succeed and could even damage the labor movement in Seattle, orders were given to end the strike. Subsequent to the Seattle strike, all strikes during the next 6 months were demonized in the press as crimes against society, conspiracies against the government, and plots to establish communism. A bomb plot was then uncovered on April 28th, and among its intended victims was Mayor Hansen, apparently a target for a squashing of the strike. On September 9th, the Boston police force went on strike. A panic that Reds were behind the strike took over Boston, despite the lack of any radicalism on part of the striking police officers. Although the city experienced primarily looting and vandalism, newspapers around the country ran inflammatory headlines. Stories told of massive riots, reigns of terror, federal troops firing machine guns on a mob. On September 13th, Police Commissioner Curtis announced that striking policemen would not be allowed to return, and Governor Calvin Coolidge called out the National Guard. The strike was effectively ended. Coolidge rides his fame for ending this strike all the way to the White House, as he will become Vice President and later President of the United States. Weeks later, a nationwide steel strike. On September 22nd, 275,000 steel workers walked off their jobs, and soon the strikers numbered almost 400,000. Three-quarters of Pittsburgh's steel mills were shut down, and strikers estimated that the strike was 90% effective. Riots attributed only to the strikers, with no newspapers laying any blame on police or political leaders, resulted in many places. In Gary, Indiana, for example, unrest was so prevalent that martial law was declared on October 5th. The steel owners held fast, and in January of 1920, with less than a third of the strikers still out, the strike ended without the strikers gaining a single. As a result of the strikes and unrest, the strikers were branded as Reds and as being unpatriotic. Fear strikes leading to a communist revolution spread throughout the country, and hysteria took hold. The strikes garnered national attention, but race riots occurred in over 30 cities from 1919 to 1920. While the strikes had garnered national attention, race riots were occurring in cities throughout the United States. In 1919, there were over 30 riots in cities throughout the country. These are largely in response to the Great Migration and African Americans moving to the north and whites resisting their movement into their cities. In addition to the riots, there were two sets of bombings that took place in the spring of 1919. In April, and then again in June of 1919. In April, 36 dynamite-filled bombs were mailed to leading figures throughout the United States, including officials of the Justice Department, newspaper editors, and businessmen, including John D. Rockefeller. Although none of the bombs actually exploded, when word hit the newspapers of these activities, Americans were fearful that the anarchists and radicals, the same people that were responsible for the activities in Eastern Europe, had reached the United States. At the same time, anarchist Luigi Galini had attempted to mail a bomb to Attorney General Mitchell Palmer. Officials intercepted the first bomb, but the second bombing occurred in June of 1919. Actually, was set on Palmer's front porch. It went off, and although Palmer and his family, including his wife, were escaped injury, an innocent passerby was killed in this attack. When news of this hit the newspapers, as well as the bombing that occurred on Wall Street in June 1919, Americans were convinced that their way of life, their democratic values, their institutions were being threatened by radicals, and severe action needed to be taken.